The story of the American Revolution is one of the most pivotal moments in world history, but the real question is whether it was truly inevitable. When we look closely at the causes, the long-standing tensions, and the way both Britain and the colonies acted, it becomes clear that independence was bound to happen. The revolution wasn't just about a single event like the Boston Tea Party or one law like the Stamp Act. It was the culmination of decades of political, economic, and cultural differences that made it impossible for the colonies and Britain to remain united under one crown. To begin with, the roots of inevitability were planted long before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, played a massive role. Britain emerged victorious, but victory came at a steep financial cost. The war left Britain with a huge debt, and the Crown looked to the American colonies to help pay for it. This moment shifted the relationship from one of relative autonomy to one where Britain wanted tighter control. Colonists, however, had grown used to self-governing through their local assemblies, and they saw these new demands as a violation of their rights. This was the beginning of a growing divide that could no longer be patched over. Another major factor was the concept of taxation without representation. The British government introduced a series of taxes, from the Sugar Act to the infamous Stamp Act, believing that since the colonies benefited from British military protection, they should contribute financially. But colonists argued that only their elected representatives had the authority to tax them. This wasn't just about money, it was about principle. The idea that Parliament across the ocean could pass laws and taxes for people who had no voice in that body was unacceptable. This fueled a sense of injustice that no compromise seemed able to solve. Britain, instead of listening to the concerns of its colonies, doubled down with even stricter measures. The Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers. These actions created resentment and tension in everyday life, making colonists feel like second-class citizens in their own land. And when protests broke out, like in Boston, Britain responded with even more force. The Boston Massacre in 1770 showed just how far things had escalated. 5 colonists were killed when British soldiers fired into a crowd, and the event was used by revolutionary leaders as evidence of tyranny. Beyond taxation and laws, another reason the revolution was inevitable lies in the identity of the colonists themselves. Over generations, people in the 13 colonies began to see themselves less as British subjects and more as Americans. They had developed their own economies, their own religions, and their own culture that was different from England. Enlightenment ideas of liberty, natural rights, and self-governance spread widely, inspiring people to imagine a new kind of society. Influential figures like John Locke and later Thomas Paine with his pamphlet Common Sense fueled this belief that independence was not only possible but morally right. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 further highlighted the impossibility of reconciliation. When colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor as a protest against the Tea Act, Britain retaliated with the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. These measures closed Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and gave more power to royal governors. Instead of intimidating the colonies into obedience, these acts united them in resistance. Colonists who might not have supported rebellion before began to see Britain as an oppressor. At this point, the road back to cooperation was nearly closed. The First Continental Congress in 1774 marked another turning point. Leaders from different colonies, who once thought of themselves as separate, came together to coordinate resistance against Britain. The unity itself was a powerful statement. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened in 1775, the shooting had already begun in Lexington and Concord. When blood was spilled, reconciliation became almost impossible. Once colonists had fought and died against British troops, the idea of returning to British rule no longer seemed acceptable to many. It's also important to remember that Britain's leadership played a role in making the revolution unavoidable. King George III and his ministers consistently underestimated colonial resistance and overestimated their ability to enforce control across the Atlantic. Instead of offering real concessions, they issued threats and punishments. This hardened colonial attitudes and convinced many that negotiation was hopeless. Britain's failure to adapt its policies to the realities of the colonies was a key reason independence became inevitable. At the same time, the colonies had practical reasons to believe they could succeed. America was vast, with widespread settlements and difficult terrain that made controlling it nearly impossible for Britain's military. Colonists also had experience fighting in militias, especially from the French and Indian War. And crucially, they had strong leadership in figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and later Thomas Jefferson. With determination, organization, and eventually foreign support, especially from France, the revolution had a real chance of succeeding. By 1776, the inevitability of the revolution was sealed with the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's words made clear that the colonies saw their break from Britain not as a rash rebellion but as the only path left. The Declaration argued that when a government violates the natural rights of its people, the people have the right to form a new government. This wasn't just political theory, it was a justification for why the revolution had to happen. The revolution wasn't a sudden spark. It was a fire that had been smoldering for years. And when it finally erupted, it changed not just the fate of the 13 colonies but the future of the world, inspiring revolutions and movements for freedom across the globe. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more fascinating historical insights.